Hello and welcome to a new episode, this time with Michael Hardt. Michael Hardt is a professor of literature at the Trinity College of Arts and Science at Duke University. He and Antonio Negri explored in their trilogy, Empire from 2000, Multitude from 2004, and Commonwealth from 2009, the contemporary forms of domination and hierarchy, as well as democratic ways and social movements that resist those types of hierarchy and domination. Few days ago, or maybe I should say tomorrow, he will publish his latest book called The Subversive Seventies, a book which explores the revolutionary movements in the 70s in many countries. Self-management watch factories in France, ungovernable factories in the US, gay liberation movements, and many, many other social movements he tries to analyze in his book. Dear Michael, I'm truly honored that you followed my invitation. I read many of your books in my university and also privately, and I'm a huge fan, and it's a privilege to have you on this program.
I'm glad to be here.
Let us start the discussion with a short biography. What did motivate you to study, and did you have any academic role models?
I'm not sure if I had academic role models. I had political desires and in fact, when I was an undergraduate at university and I was an engineering major, I thought that I worked with alternative energy. I thought that would be a political project. I quickly became disabused of the possibilities of political change that way. And I think, really for academic role models, I started with activism. And after I was graduated from university, so in my early 20s, I became first involved with migration questions, especially with people fleeing U.S. wars from El Salvador and Guatemala, and it was from there that I really developed scholarly interests and scholarly promise. In fact, something I would say for the entire, for the last, 40 years or something, I've struggled with, and I'm sure many others listening to this too, how to bring together my scholarly interests and my activist interests. Sometimes it feels like I have a day job that pays me doing scholarly work, and then a night job, which is really what I want to do, doing activist work, and the two don't fit well together. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. That's sort of it's an ongoing struggle.
As always, I'm asking this question because in academia there is a fight going on between the soft and hard science, or between those who think that if you are doing normative science with a normative perspective, you're not we cannot take you serious, and so how do you respond to that type of criticism? Could you be objective in the same time with a normative impetus? Or
I don't think I recognize I recognize what you're saying and the way that debate works, but it doesn't correspond to the way I think about things. I have a partisan interest in science, and science, the production of knowledge, and it serves politically. So it's not saying objective. I'm not sure. I think it's true. I have, for instance, I remember when Tony and I published Empire, someone asked me something about it. I think we're right. I put it in those terms rather than as if there were some neutral, objective position. So anyway, I think of theory as a weapon. Theory is a way of pursuing our political projects, which doesn't mean, like I say, that there's nothing true, that there's nothing right, but it only functions such that way within a politicized field. That's the way that's the way I think about it. Does that? I realize that it shifts the axes of your question, but maybe that's what one has to do, is to shift the axes of that debate that's happening within universities.
Absolutely, yes. And just counting empirically does not change the world as it is. And if you take, for example, Black liberation movements, if you say, I have to count just what I see and I can observe and not what it should be, so then how can change happen? And nobody will agree that that change in this circumstance, apartheid regimes or yeah. So yeah, it's a funny argument, but yeah. So you completed your dissertation on Gilles Deleuze, and I'm interested, how do you became interested in thinkers like Gilles? You spent many years of reading his books. I saw also an interview with you, which can be seen on YouTube. Yeah, how do you became interested in Gilles?
I, it was via a strange route, I suppose, the Italian political developments of the 1970s, which interested me. And I even have to take one step back. I hope this doesn't sound too long, which is that, I mentioned earlier, I've been as a 20-year-old with the migrants from Central America, then became more involved in El Salvador, understanding and kind of supporting, yes, their revolutionary struggles. But it realized at the time that what they were doing, what the revolution was doing in El Salvador at the time in the 1980s did not correspond to what was possible in the US. And so it was then that reading about Italy in the 1970s, something that had already been defeated, corresponded much better to me to what I saw as possible and desirable in the US. So from that, then I started reading about Italy in the 1970s, and that got, in a way, to Deleuze. First, I had read a book that Tony Negri and Félix Guattari wrote together. This was in the early 1980s. And then through Guattari, I realized, he's writing with this philosopher, Deleuze, and that led me to Deleuze, which, yeah, like I was saying before, I mean, my writing about Deleuze then was very scholarly. It was not on it was half of it was about Spinoza. I can't think of a philosopher more, how should we put it, difficult and foundational in that way. So it didn't directly address, or rather, I didn't have a direct access, I suppose, between that scholarly interest in Deleuze as a philosopher, his treatment of the history of philosophy, and my political desires. I suppose I discovered later in the writings with Guattari, or I worked more later in the writings with Guattari, with the kind of mediation of how to think both at the deepest levels of the history of philosophy and contemporary political problems.
For those who want to hear your thoughts on the book Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, and your thoughts on the philosophy of Deleuze, just have a look at the interview with you with Brad Evans. It was a great discussion, and he's also a philosopher, and he can dig deeper into the book. And yeah, it was a great interview. People from the VIPR community told me to ask you, you wrote so many books with Antonio Negri. How did you get to know him, and what do you have in common? How would you describe your relationship?
Well, first, how I met him, which was a rather, let's see, I don't know, long process, in the sense that, like I said, I'd been intrigued by or inspired by political activities of the 1970s in Italy, of which Tony was a part. And I'd read his books and were interested in them. And in order to meet him, so this was in 1985, I think, and he was living in Paris, but in clandestine and fugitive from Italy. In order to meet him, I translated a book of his on Spinoza, and then got in touch via a friend with him, saying, which was true, of course, that I had translation questions. And so he called me and then suggested, why don't you come to Paris for a week and we'll talk about translation questions, which sounded fantastic to me. And I went to Paris for a week and we had a really good time. And he said, why don't you just move to Paris and we'll do things together? And so I did. And we did. So for the last 35 years or so, you know, quite a long time, we've been doing things together. He's been, you know, extremely generous to me. And yeah, it's a fantastic relationship, you know, kind of magical for me. It's, you know, I think it's quite rare or maybe more difficult than people understand to create a collaborative writing relationship. And yeah, to collaborate in this kind of writing is, I think, something rare and to hold on to. Yeah, and so anyway, Tony and I have been doing that for quite a long time, as you pointed out. In fact, this book, The Subversive Seventies, the one you mentioned earlier, that is just coming out now, is the first book I've written alone, you know, without Tony, in 35 years. So it was kind of a strange process for me, you know, feeling a bit, you know, like a limb was cut off. You know, how do you do this without doing it together? Anyway, I mean, he treated me like a comrade. You know, that's what it amounts to, and I'm grateful. You know, and it's been great.
Sounds so nice, and it is wonderful. And I suppose that you ask him questions, he asks you questions, and then you discuss things. Maybe you agree, then you disagree, and so this is a fertile ground for get deeper and deeper into theory, and I can imagine that this is a productive way of writing books.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think we do learn from each other. It doesn't often function, strangely, it often doesn't function in that agree-disagree part. It's more like one of us says something the other doesn't understand, and usually there's a kind of education process that goes on after that. I mean, we come with different knowledges, which I'm sure everyone can imagine. I mean, partly we're of different generations. You know, I grew up in the US, and he in Italy, and so we have different perspectives, and sometimes, rather than disagree, it's more like often in discussions, it's like, I do not know what you're talking about. And then, and sometimes then we leave something aside. You know, if the other person can't figure it out, we leave it aside. But usually it's a kind of learning process that, you know, months later, the other person will come back and say, okay, I get that now, you know, and then we can work with that. I mean, as you know, for instance, in the US, you know, in these last decades, work in Black studies, feminist studies, queer studies has been much more prominent than in Italy and France, where Tony is working. I mean, or at least differently. So you can imagine that part of that is part of our learning process, you know, getting the other person to read things that seem essential, and and working that way.
Yeah, sounds fantastic. In your book, together with Antonio Negri, called Empire, you demonstrated that power structures are hard to pinpoint also in a single analysis. It's complex, it's diverse, it's multi-dimensional, and because there are many factors like nation states, local actors, social movements, transnational corporations, international frameworks, and also this capitalist productive system. So it's hard to say who is the sovereign actor in this game, and it's hard to I learned a lot from this book, that the power structure changed. In my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you disagree, but in my opinion, it is a continuation of the thinking of Michel Foucault, because Foucault also analyzed how power structures changed over the decades. And how the political, economical situation also changed the structure of how society organizes. And yeah, in my opinion, this is a continuation of his thought, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. Foucault is insisting in those writings in the 1970s, Discipline and Punish, the first volume of History of Sexuality, that, he's insistent that power is not a thing that can be possessed, and that it also isn't doesn't have a centralized point of dictation. That's his thing. And it's certainly true that we're also thinking in that regard that power functions as a multiplicity. That might be also a Foucauldian way of saying it. But what is quite different, I think, is that we are looking at the institutions of a global system of power, not the way he was doing it, and perhaps wouldn't. I'm trying to think if he would feel displeased by this. One thing I would just like to add, and I think it's part of the dynamic, just coming back to the very beginning when I was trying to talk about the difficulties of working between an activist life and a scholarly life. One of the things I've been cognizant of, and constantly impressed by is how social movements, contemporary social movements, liberation movements are able to do theoretical work in a different register, perhaps, than scholarly work, but recognize similar conditions. And this was something that I remarked on often after the publication of Empire, because that was the period of these globalization protest movements. And I thought they were developing in their own way, the kind of theorizing that happens in social movements, a very similar map of global structures of power. Because if one were still thinking that imperialism, for instance, was the defining factor in the global order, one should every week be protesting in front of the Pentagon or the White House or something like that. But instead, what was going on, this is 20 years ago, and I think was very intelligent, was a kind of experimentation to recognize the new power structure, so that one weekend it would be protests to the summit of the World Trade Organization, another one of the World Bank and the IMF, and then the G8 meetings. And then, so it was like, I saw it as kind of like theoretical work of shining a light on these different nodes of an articulated power structure. That the movements, I know there was quite a bit of, and justified, I suppose, criticism of the summit hopping model, because that's like I said, each time activists would go and protest at a different meeting. But I think theoretically it's indication of a very intelligent theoretical investigation. Yeah, there you go. And that's what I guess I would like to approach social movements or liberation movements in general from that perspective. What kind of theoretical work is going on in the movements? That's what I've been trying to do in about the 1970s recently, and I think in the work with Tony, we've been doing it with the contemporary movements, trying at each point to ask what are the problematics that they're posing, what are the theoretical problems that they're illuminating, what kind of solutions do they offer. I feel like that's been a big part of our work.
Absolutely, and I learned a lot. I learned, for example, that since the Roman Empire, we have dictatorship together hand in hand with a plebeian institution, hand in hand with oligarchic structure. So it makes the analysis more complex but at the same time you understand how society and power structure work. And also in the light of the discussion between we are the good guys because we have liberal democracies and they are the bad guys, you also have to differentiate what is democracy. It is liberal democracy in the framework of capitalist production, nation state, and so one has to differentiate. And I believe Empire helps to grasp the complexity. I believe so. And then also, but maybe we can come to the term and concept of multitude later, when we are talking about your latest book, because in the first book you analyze power structures, and then also with this book, but also with Multitude, I believe from 2009, you try to discover subversive social egalitarian movements who tries to not only dismantle and deconstruct the narrative hierarchies, forms of domination, but also try to, you know, set up a different way of behaving, of being, of producing. And yeah, I'm curious. So how started your latest book, and what is your key motivation to observe the 70s? Why the 70s? what is so special about the 70s?
You know, a lot of cultural memory is focused on the 1960s as the last great revolutionary movement, you know, of the and the icons. I think there's also in memory a kind of in collective memory a kind of, what you call it, sanitizing of the 1960s, which gives the image of goodness and peace and also a kind of dignified approach to power. I mean, the images in the U.S., I don't know, from Woodstock to the March on the Selma Bridge, or a very dignified image of the 1960s. I think the 70s are actually more important, the revolutionary movements, and more important, especially for us. In fact, I would argue that our era begins in the 1970s. And one way you could say this is that the forms of power shifted, and that those new forms of power are the ones we confront today. Many have worked, for instance, on the concept and the practices of neoliberalism that from the 1970s studies, or questions about post-Fordism or post-Taylorism, different kinds of shifts in work, et cetera. So in some ways, you could say we're facing the same enemy. More, I'd say, is that the political movements are facing the same problems, or they recognize the same problems, and those are our problems for today. And that's what, so I think that they're important, these revolutionary movements of the 1970s. On the one hand, you could say because we can see there the seeds of the movements today, you know, that these, and I'll give you an example in a minute of the way we can see what they were doing is now developed in different ways. But more important to me is the ways that the movements in the 70s are way ahead of us. Like we need to catch up to the 70s, and that they present something, like I said, that's on the same political terrain that we occupy, but actually had more I don't know. They're in many ways, you know, like more audacious and radical, but also more substantial political solutions and visions. Yeah, put it that way. I mean, another thing that maybe part of it here is the ability to think in terms of liberation, which in many domains in the 1970s was a key vision. You know, so feminist liberation, worker liberation, gay liberation, Black liberation. I mean, it was a key term, but it was also represented or signified the radical nature of the change that was possible. In some ways, we've lost or social movements seem today to have less ability to pose the radical nature of liberation. I mean, here's something that would more discussion. I'm thinking of how a U.S. scholar, Keeanga Taylor, and comrade Keeanga Taylor says it, which is, you know, that rather than thinking of Black liberation, which was posed in the 1970s, today the slogan Black Lives Matter, you know, important and everything, but that's a serious downgrade. I mean, that's it, from liberation to simply that lives matter. And I think that's true in other domains too. Anyway, so So that's one of the things that interests me about the 1970s is the radicality of the vision. And that functions in many regards. And so, like I said earlier, and this is maybe the way I think in general, what I'm interested in I'm not so much interested just in the history of the movements, this movement did this in this country then. I'm no historian, et cetera. What I'm interested really in is the concepts that the movements produced and the way they developed them. The concept of democracy, which you mentioned earlier, which was a very active discourse and proposal in the 1970s. I mean, the notion of a revolutionary democracy that has very little to do with what we're sold as being democracy today, throughout the world. In the anti-colonial movements in Guinea-Bissau, in Chile, in Portugal, in the European and US context too, a notion of radical democracy and the institutions of a revolutionary democracy were super important to the movements. Another axis you could think about this is what we were talking about, multiplicity of power a few minutes ago, which was Tony and I were certainly concerned with in Empire. It's on a different axis that this was developed in many movements in the 1970s, which is both about the multiplicity of power that was a kind of foreshadowing or anticipation of what later came to be called intersectionality, like recognizing the ways that different structures of power, patriarchy, capital, white supremacy, are both interrelated and mutually constitutive. But more important, or equally important at least, is the possibilities of articulation between movements of liberation. It's this kind of multiplicity that I'm really interested in the 1970s. The way, like one often says today, and this is certainly true, that we need a movement that is both queer, feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, etc. But the modes of articulation of linking those together, or even when one talks about convergence, I think one needs to talk politically about such abstract terms, like one has to then go to the specific instances of the ways the different groups were doing it. But at least I'm hoping you could see why I might be interested. And because, of course, why I'm interested in the 1970s is because I think it does for us today. Otherwise, if it were just a kind of like, work of archaeology or history in a different sense, then it wouldn't interest me so much.
From an analytical and scientific perspective, I have two questions. The first one is, how do you differentiate in your analysis between the different groups? For example, there are white supremacists that gather and demonstrate and make demonstrations against, for example, queer, feminist liberations, and so on and so forth. So, and if you I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on right-wing actors, but maybe if you ask them in an interview and maybe they see themselves also as revolutionaries, they so how do you separate this kind of movements from progressive or liberational movements?
For me, it's not that hard. I think that one could start with if it were necessary to think about freedom, equality, and social solidarity. And so certainly, supremacists, they certainly act out on love for each other and love for their own kind and such things. But equality and freedom, as we understand it, I think this is maybe another thing to say, is one has to struggle over those concepts themselves. what is meant by equality, what is meant by freedom, maybe even by social solidarity or something like that. But more interesting, or another interesting point from what you say, which is slightly allied with your question, but not exactly a response to it, is I think that in general, and I'm not sure if I could say this in an exclusive way, the political inventions happen on the side of revolution and liberation movements, and that the right-wing movements essentially are recuperative reactions of that. Like, so, I mean, here's a silly example from the US, or not silly, a rather anecdotal example from the US. I remember in the 1980s, there was a movement called Operation Rescue. It was an anti-abortion movement that was, and the way they conducted actions were through what they called sit-in strikes, which were exactly what students and anti-war demonstrators had been doing a decade earlier. They would do a sit-in strike in front of the abortion clinic. And if you were to look at it from the outside, you would say, well, it's the same thing. Look, here 10 years earlier, they were sitting in front of a military recruitment center or something else. And then now they're sitting, so they look the same, but they're, of course, exactly opposite. So I think there could be, maybe one has to say that one has to look at the concepts behind the actions that, now I'm not posing that quite the right way, but what is the political content behind them? Yeah, maybe that's the better way of saying it. So it's a bit generic. It doesn't seem right to, one often talks in colloquial terms about the Reagan Revolution, about Nazi fascism as a revolution. I think it's a reaction, not a revolution. I mean, I think that the revolutionary action happens first, and then there is a recuperation and redeployment in reactionary terms. That would be my way of saying it. I mean, I could even think of that in terms of principles that Tony and I have tried to work with, or maybe I should call them axioms, like in a mathematical sense. Like the way we say it is that resistance comes before power. There we're thinking about Foucault. In fact, we're thinking about this is a scholarly part that most viewers should probably just cut out, which is that it's a footnote in Deleuze's book about Foucault, where he says, you read Foucault's work and many people think that resistance is a reaction to power. And the term seems to suggest that, there is power and then you resist that power. He says, no, you misunderstand. Resistance is prior to power. And when Deleuze says that, he doesn't mean necessarily chronologically prior. He means that it's ontologically prior, which for him means that resistance is the moment of invention. Power is the moment of recuperation. So anyway, that's what I mean when I'm trying to go to these instances too. I think that the political invention and social invention happens in movements of liberation, and that these forces of reaction are in some ways parasitical on them.
And my second question is also in the same direction. For example, we know all the different kind of left wing. The spectrum of the left wing is big. We have anarchists, which do not see the state, for example, as an actor who liberates, and we have social democrats on the other end of the spectrum that see through reforms, through laws and so on, we can change society. And maybe Rosa Luxemburg was both of them and and transcend both of them. But anyways, and here my question is, for example, as we know, a few weeks ago, I did interview David North from the Trotsky movement, and in his opinion, and I saw many even intellectuals who are saying that no, we should focus on the workers and we have a class struggle and we should, this orthodox Marxist point of view. They take Marx very seriously, and for them there is only class struggle and only the workers who should be taken serious into analytical, into account. So how would you describe that movement, and how would yeah, is it a contradiction, or do you use also, okay, let's focus also on the workers union? So and what about intersectionality? Is it a contradiction? Is it, yeah, how can we understand it? And yeah.
So before really responding, I think it is important when looking at the map of the left to and recognizing the kinds of divisions you were talking about. There are social democrats, there are anarchists, there are Trotskyists, there, etc. I think it's important to recognize when these importance have political significance. There are moments when the difference between Marxists and anarchists were significant and there had to be a fight. But many moments, and I would say we're in one now, when the differences are well outweighed by the common projects. And so I think recognizing so what you're proposing though is something where perhaps where one does need to have a fight. And here again, I found very useful some of the political developments in the 1970s. I mean, sorry to go on about this 1970s. As you know, I'm completely embedded in it at the moment. But in many countries, there was a shift in the 1970s, or rather a recognition among the movements of the end of the centrality of the industrial worker to projects of liberation. Now, that doesn't mean, and so I'm thinking, this was particularly clear for me in segments of the Italian movements during that period, but also in reading, and I'm less knowledgeable about the German movements, but certainly there too. And the US has a particular complicated and difficult relationship. So that the industrial workers movement, I would say at the beginning of the 70s, there was exactly what you were proposing earlier from your previous interview, that there was the belief that the left as a whole, or the liberation process as a whole, was able to be represented by the class struggle of industrial workers, which is a segment of the working class, obviously, but thought to be a leading class that could represent all the others. And so, of course, there's a race question, there's a woman question, et cetera, this way as posed, but they are some way subsumed under the centrality of the industrial workers movement. And in the beginning of the 1970s, industrial workers movement were extremely strong and powerful in the first years, in the European context, in the US context, in Argentina, many countries around the world. But those industrial workers movements were in many ways defeated. They were defeated both through military means, repressive means, by the state and by capital. They were also defeated by a restructuring of capital and an undermining industrial workers. And what developed, and this is, I'm sorry for the long way of getting around to it, is exactly what I think of as an answer to this problem, which is that it was not a refusal of struggle, but rather recognition that the industrial workers, that the class struggle of industrial workers could not be the central focus that represented all the others. So recognizing the necessity of liberation struggle posed as a multiplicity of struggles. Like that's what, it might be easier to understand this than, the term intersectionality has become used in so many different ways recently that it's sometimes difficult to propose. But I mean, I often go by Angela talks about, we need to talk about an intersectionality of struggles, not just an intersectionality of power. And that's what I'm talking about here, which is, so it's not, a class struggle is still, I mean, I of course, posed class struggle as an important component of any struggle for liberation. I'm only hesitated on that because, this is part of Tony and my argument about multitude as a concept, really, is that one can't think working class only as industrial workers. Industrial work, of course, still important, but there's a lot more to the class. And then there's also, one has to think the working class in a more multiple way. Okay, I got distracted though, because that's only one component of the struggle. I mean, I think anti-racist struggle, feminist struggle, queer struggle, these all have to be posed politically together. We have to construct strategically the possibility of these functioning on equal ground and articulated together. So anyway, I don't think it's that maybe just to close the circle, it's not a question. For me, it would be wrong for someone to say, are you for class struggle or against class struggle? Of course, class struggle is important. That's not the question. The question is, what is the possibility of articulating class struggle with struggles that are relatively autonomous, but nonetheless have to be mutually formulated? And that's what seems to be a key problematic for us today. And like I said, I think many movements in the 1970s are more advanced than us in being able to think through that political problem.
In a lecture, I cannot remember, in a lecture of yours, I heard something, you differentiate between, the traditional work and the productive work, and then I cannot remember the term, immaterial, unproductive, something like that work. So maybe Marx was right in the 19th century and 1850s and when and now also the term work changed because so it's difficult to say what kind of work should we appreciate, and when we talk about workers, who are they?
Mm-hmm.
Are we academics also workers?
I think it's an important political project to define what constitutes the working class and those who work. I mean, part of what Tony and I were part of the motivation, in the 1990s for thinking about the notion of multitude, and like you were referring to, how should we understand immaterial production? Part of the inspiration was socialist feminist work for the 1980s, really, that wanted to recognize as work unwaged domestic work that was clearly gendered, but also in a way unwaged components of waged work. The ways that gender focuses, like Tony and I call it affective labor, but emotional work or some of the, so that's only one component of expanding the conception of work, and also therefore forcing us to expand the notion of working class. But I think it's not only it's a political discussion, it's a political project. That these are definitions that are the result of politics, not some sort of abstract scientific categories. And I think, like I said, one aspect of it is that feminists had posed and have, continually posed on the agenda a reconception of what of how we should understand work.
Absolutely, and here we have again terms like democracy, terms like freedom, solidarity, even love, and work contested, and they can change. The signifier can change with Laclau. I observed that you, in your latest book, you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned only once the term multitude, but you often talk about multiplicity. Could you explain for those who didn't read your books? You have, in my opinion, three big terms that are quite similar but different: assembly, multitude, and multiplicity. Could you, for people who do not understand the differences, explain the three terms, concepts, and maybe later you can elaborate why multitude did not, come up in your latest book so often.
In some ways, the three terms are linked, like you're suggesting, but at different levels of abstraction. Multiplicity seems to me at a conceptual level, recognizing actually it not only is posing that there are things that are multiple, but that they can function together, and the nature of the ways that they function together. So one talks about a multiplicity, or multiplicities plural, but each multiplicity is composed of many elements. And this is a very philosophical level. I mean, I'm thinking there. We were talking earlier about the work of Deleuze and Foucault, and they were trying in many ways to work through this concept of multiplicity. And I found it useful in a way importing it to the discourses of the work that would lead to the term intersectionality. So the work of socialist feminists understanding capitalist patriarchy and anti-racist scholars understanding racial capitalism, understanding using multiplicity in these ways of understanding the ways they link together. Multitude instead, for when Tony and I began employing it, was to try to open up or recognize the multiple nature, as a multiplicity of a series of categories, like class, like that we were talking about. So we thought of multitude way of understanding class in an expanded and multiple way, and not as unified, but nonetheless. So in some ways, you could say that by using the term multitude, we were hoping that we could recognize that there's a plurality of struggles and there's a plurality of social subjects, but that the fact of it being a plurality doesn't mean that it can't act together. So that was, in some ways, the multitude was named, the hope was that it could designate a subject, a potential revolutionary subject from what are a plurality. But you're right, it's very closely linked to this notion of multiplicity. And assembly is really just is on a different level. Much now we're proceeding towards the more practical of these three in this series of three. Assembly is the mode that many movements have used recently, perhaps for the last 50 years, to try to institutionalize democratic and equal relations. So the nature of the General Assembly, so think of the movements in 2011, of the so-called Indignados in Spain, or the occupation of the Syntagma Square in Greece, or Occupy Wall Street later. In some ways, the Arab Spring things too, they all function through assemblies. And the assembly was meant as a mechanism for collective decision-making, and each one had its own rules. Anyone who's been, part of these assemblies knows, well, both the frustrations of it, but also the production of it. I mean, the rules can speak and when, trying to create mechanisms so that those who don't normally have the possibility to speak first, that sort of thing. So assembly is a way of trying to, I would say, you could put it this way. Yeah, okay, let's try. I'm now appreciating your question more. If multiplicity is at the more conceptual level, multitude was in some ways trying to project that politically, as a subject. Assembly is a practice. It's a practice for allowing a political effectiveness of this political plurality, a multiplicity in action. That in some ways the assembly is a mechanism for doing that. And I should also say, but I was hinting at this a few minutes ago, not a perfect one, or at least the assemblies that I've participated in each of the struggles I named, or the more recent ones. I mean, it's a work in progress. It's something, but the intention, and it's not surprising to me that assemblies keep, keep appearing in each of the recent movements, because it's like I say, it's trying to create an institution of democratic participation.
I believe 10 years ago at the Barclays Center, you held a lecture, and one can see it on YouTube as well. You said that multitude is singularity plus cooperation, and that made a lot of that was a nice, a nice summary of that. And then you moved on, and you said that you differentiated the multitude from the notion of the people, because the people functions as unity and representation. And so this movement's multitude, and especially multiplicity, they are like crowds and masses and so on, but they refuse this leadership. So this is also central. Also, what we said in the beginning, how you differentiate, and from an analytical perspective, what are you looking at? Masses, crowds, gatherings. I read a wonderful article from Martin Barreau, The Plebeian Moment, and he observed three events, I believe, the Venetian festivals and the spontaneous acts and the spontaneous dimension of gathering, and also there is in drinking, dancing, laughing, some subversive elements, and it was quite funny that he termed it plebeian. So I drew some parallels when I was reading your book. Funny. And also maybe I can point out that 5 years ago at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, you presented the key thesis of assembly, and there you talked at the different forms of organization, structure, and hierarchy. It also made me think a lot of how to use these terms. So also one can watch that. It's very interesting if someone wants to move and dig deeper into into your work. But reading is the best way. So let's move on to the next question. In your chapter 4, you speak about you are speaking about strategic multiplicities. So you said before that multiplicity is the different kinds of movements that have different roots, different opinions, different kind of struggles. So what is the strategic part of it? Is it, for example, a common enemy? Is it, for example, Ernesto Laclau talks about, the common enemy, and then in front of that we can gather and we can articulate, some sort of policy or claim.
It is perhaps important recognizing the nature of the interwoven nature of power. It's important to recognize the interwoven nature of power. On the one hand, like you're suggesting via Laclau, for instance, when socialist feminists were trying to convince their socialist colleagues that they needed to be, in order to be anti-capitalist, they also had to be feminist. Part of the question is saying, look, actual capital and patriarchy are interwoven. The same thing we would say about a category and recognizing the interwoven nature of racial capital. But I think it's more important the other side of it. Like, I recognize the common enemy thing. It's more important the other side, and that is what is the strategic operation of articulating the different struggles. And one of the things, part of what I mean by strategic here is creating a condition without priority between them. So this was something that I was very interested in various movements in the 1970s. So let me give you some questions about racial multiplicities. Here's two examples about them. One, which was very well known in the US, which was a student strike that started at San Francisco College by they call themselves the Third World Liberation Front, and it was a combination of the Black students, the Mexican students, the other Latin American students, Chinese students, Filipino students, the different students groups, and they formed this Third World Liberation Front. What's interesting to me is that in order for such a racial multiplicity to function, and this I consider a racial multiplicity, there has to be created strategically the conditions of a lack of priority among the groups. And you can't say, it seems to me it makes no sense to talk about equality, because what would one mean by measuring? Like, would one measure the degree of suffering and the degree of Mexican American suffering, or how could one measure such things? I think instead, for such a group to function, it's a strategic choice to create the conditions where there isn't a priority among the different struggles. Here's another example that in some ways is more complicated, but at least could see more straightforward. I was interested in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, also in the 1970s. And there's a way that Steve Biko, who was one of the leaders in the Black consciousness movement, posed it, which was that he said that to be Black, anyone who was non-white in South Africa, part of the South Asian Indian community, the so-called colored community, they are Black when they are part of the Black struggle. And conversely, people who have Black skin who are not part of the Black struggle are not Black. So I think like he says, for instance, the notion of a Black policeman is a contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing, because he's defining race politically, and that the way I would call this within the Black consciousness movement a racial multiplicity. The way doing that is to say that there is not a priority between the struggle of those who are Black Africans and the struggle of those who are from the Indian community, for instance, and that under Black, Black constructed here now as a political category, there is a possibility to articulate between them. And like I say, that's not based on some empirical recognition, like one did a study and said the domination over South Asians and the domination over Black Africans is the same. They're not equal because of that. It's rather a strategic decision to create the possibility of multiplicity. And so I would say the same thing with today, when we talk about the possibility of a struggle or a convergence among queer, Black, anti-capitalist, feminist struggles, there has to be, at least if we're going to learn from these movements in the 1970s, there has to be the strategic construction of the possibility of articulation among them, which requires this, I'm at least translating from the movements I studied, a lack of priority among them. It's not as if the anti-capitalist struggle has priority, like you were saying earlier from a different interview, and these other struggles, okay, they're important, but they really follow behind it. It's not also like the Black struggle is the most important thing. And yes, we're also anti-capitalist, we're also feminist, but that's of secondary importance. It's rather that we have to create strategically, like I'm saying, the political conditions for the articulation to take place. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. I was in myself laughing a little bit because when you talked about this that a Black policeman is not Black and that is a contradiction, I was thinking on two things. First, the Haitian Revolution, and as we remember, there were a lot of Black slave traders. So in this sense, they are not Black. So yeah, it makes sense to differentiate in this kind of category, and also not essentialist, not to fall in the racist trap of white and Black, and this makes absolute sense. And then I was laughing.
Before you go to the next one, I just wanted to add a little anecdote to the Haitian one, which is there were several Haitian constitutions after the revolution. I think it's the one of 1802, anyway, some year, which declares all Haitians are black, regardless of skin color, which is another beautiful idea of, well, at least using race as a political category. I'm not, I think one has to think through in each political instance what the kind of constructs necessary are. But like you're suggesting, it functions politically, and that's what's important here. Go ahead sorry, I interrupted your second point.
No, and I wanted to just to add why I was smiling, because of I associated in my mind the film Django Unchained, Quentin Tarantino film, and Samuel L. Jackson played the Stephen, and he was also a black former slave, but he's in control of other slaves, and he he is giving information to the Calvin Candy, the Leonardo DiCaprio role. So it was it is a little bit of funny but tragic at the same time. Yeah. Let us dig deeper a little bit, my last question, into the subversive part, because people here on this, Varna Peace channel, and we are all peaceful. And then I saw an interview, what was it of you, that you are a little bit more skeptical about peace, and I understand your arguments as well. So, and to be quite honest, I have also a mixed feeling about violence and about peace. So I believe, if I quote you correctly, you denied that the road to freedom is the refusal of violence. I believe I got it from you in one of your. I do not remember. Was it a lecture or interview? But and of course, I have some difficulties with this sentence, but I understand. So let's dig deeper into the subversive part. What is subversive? Because you started in the beginning, in the introduction, you start with a quote, and I quote, that we have had nothing to do with terrorism is obvious. That we have been subversive is equally obvious. Between these two truths lies the key issue at stake in our trial. And you quote the militants of Autonomia awaiting trial in Rebibbia prison in Rome from 1983. So if somebody is listening to us, and now we have terrorism, which is, a top-down approach, in my opinion, because who sets the limits or the borders of what is terrorism, what is anti-terrorism. So I believe this is a state territory. This is not, but then we have revolution, which can be bloody, which can be peaceful. In Iran, for example, we have a peaceful revolution. Foucault was also a big fan of, I believe, Simone de Beauvoir as well. But then it did change, and it has a bitter taste, what was the result of it, but nonetheless. And now we have violence. So my question is, what is the subversive part? Does subversive mean peaceful or not peaceful? In what sense is violence necessary in order to change society, or is it not? I know it's a difficult question, and
it's not a difficult question. I mean, or maybe I'd like to shift the question a little bit, and this is maybe why subversive makes sense as a category here. Let me retreat to the 1970s again, and I hope that can work with the present. I mean, I think it was a false problem, even projected backwards in time, to think that the problem was violence versus nonviolence. I think that was not an issue. That was not the right way of thinking about it. I mean, because first of all, the movements for liberation in the 1970s, and I would say in the 1960s too, but this is part I think this gets whitewashed from the 1960s, existed in a context of extreme repression. So they were in an atmosphere of violence. Violence was not a choice. What was rather a choice was how to deal with this atmosphere of violence. And by violence here, I mean, it starts with state repression. It starts with fascist violence, often in collaboration with state forces. You know, so and we can go through all of these countries. I mean, in Latin America, and of course, it's long chronicled. You know, about the nature of the repression, the fascist forces, the links with the United States and the U.S. too. Of course, we now have lots of knowledge about it. The relationship between fascist violence and the state. In Turkey, anyway. So we're in this context. What do you do about it? It seems to me that that there was a divide in the movements, or at least I see two alternatives developed. And the alternatives were developed not so much just about the question of repression and violence, but also, this is really it's not a corollary of, but a corresponding action with the repression and the state of violence was what many people at the time, or activists at the time, were calling the end of mediation. Like the fact that the state no longer functions as a mediating force, that the labor unions no longer function as a mediating force, or what others would say, I think this is the similar recognition, is that protest is no longer effective. You know, we can protest all we want. We can have the huge protests against the Vietnam, against U.S. imperialism, etc. They won't do anything. With this lack of mediation and the context of repression, it seems to me that there were two choices. One choice, as you mentioned, there were a relatively small number of people, but extremely significant and recognized choice to meet the state repression with on equal footing. You know, so this is what, at least in part, what the clandestine armed groups were involved in. I think actually that's more complicated, but I should table that for a minute, because I think the clandestine armed groups function primarily on a logic of injustice and the impunity of injustices. And they were trying to reveal and sometimes attack directly those who had impunity for conducting injustices. But there was another route, and this is what I find more interesting, which is also not nonviolent. The double negative serves here, which is the political projects that tried to conduct mass social democratic experiments, but then them in a kind of double organization, which would also be able to protect the movement. You know, that recognized the context of, you know, so the perhaps best known one of these, at least in the US, maybe also for those listeners in Europe, is the Black Panther Party, which the Black Panther Party, of course, was, you know, formed as in part a military organization, you know, with guns. Defending the community was one of its primary principles. But there was a parallel organization of social and democratic experiments, of free clinics, of free breakfast programs, of developing the community. And so there was a kind of difficult to manage and separate, I guess. You know, that's what I mean by dual organization, recognition of the need for protection and a separate moment of the development of democratic projects. I've also been interested in, and this is something I guess I'd known about from earlier, the way movements in the 1970s, especially through the mid 1970s in Italy, had a similar dual organizational structure. You know, once, you know, defending against fascist violence, again, defending against state repression, the police, there had to be, you know, their reasoning was there had to be a mechanism of defense, but that and that allowed for a parallel organization of democratic social experiments. Right. I also wrote about a similar development in Turkey, a party called the Revolutionary Path, which I in really extreme fascist context was trying to conduct a similar kind of thing. So anyway, I'm all coming back to that just to give you an idea of what I mean by I don't think their choice was violence or nonviolence. I think their choice was, how do we manage, or can we manage, democratic social projects in a context of extreme violence? And in what ways can it be protected? Now, this, I'm not saying that we're exactly the same situation today, but I do think that that trying to pose the political question in terms of violence versus nonviolence is not a helpful one. I think one has to start really by looking at what is the political context in which we're acting, and what are the forms of repression that we're facing. And that then, in part, poses the range of possibilities. And I do think, so my criticism, you were saying before about the left groups of clandestine armed struggle, especially the ones which were not only conducting symbolic actions. When looks around the world, most of them were actually conducting symbolic actions. Like even bombings. The Weather Underground in the U.S., for instance, conducted long series of bombings, but always made sure that no one was hurt. They were symbolic bombings that tried to illuminate what injustices were being committed. But I think, and then I think the ones you're more thinking about probably a Red Army faction, Red Brigades, the Red Army faction in Japan, ones that they used kidnappings and assassinations and such forms of violence. My main criticism of them, or I think their main difficulty, was exactly their clandestinity. That their clandestine nature of these groups separated them from the development of interaction with the movements, and that led to political dead ends. So, yeah, I guess I wouldn't wage a moral argument against them. I argue against them, but in different terms, and also not in the abstract terms, like, can a revolution be conducted without violence? If they were to let us, but we've often found that those in power tend to shoot us, and we have to deal with that. I'm sorry, it was a long and circuitous answer, but it's a complicated question.
Absolutely, no, I understand you, and I'm also with myself not in in a peaceful relation because for example, if I look at the Zapatista movement, who are basically in war since 1994 with the state of Mexico, and when I look at the Kurdish revolutionary movements in Rojava in northern Syria, then I have to sympathize with them, and of course I have my critiques, but it is a liberation struggle, and we should support them.
And also, I just wanted to point out that those are excellent examples because they are, I think, in their various ways, doing exactly what I had said before, which is this notion of a dual organization. Like they manage it differently. Of course, they're in different contexts, but the Zapatistas have a military wing and they have a military structure. However, however much they try to subvert that, even the notion of the subcomandante when Marcos existed was already trying to subvert it. But in Rojava, the violence is much more present and continuous, and they are able to, that's what's so admirable about them, is that they're able to develop democratic experiments in a context that's so violent, and that couldn't be done, if they were just to say, please don't hurt us, we're just going to be peaceful. they wouldn't last a day. So they I don't know. In my estimation, and I think what you were saying too, those are good examples because they recognize the context of violence in which they're engaged.
Absolutely, and a historic example would be the Spain in 1930s. So yeah,
right.
When I was reading your chapter on revolutionary democracies and this guy Amilcar Cabral, who who was a leader in Guinea-Bissau, I was also thinking about what can I gain from this book and this, especially this chapter. In order, for example, because you are here describing social movements and African liberation struggles, how can I draw a parallel? Maybe there is no parallel with today's coup d'états in sub-Sahara Africa. For example, we have this Ibrahim Traoré, which on a symbolic level, he's what is it called? This military Kepi? No, I don't know. And he's symbolically referring to Thomas Sankara, and also his anti-colonial speeches. I was listening. Yeah, one can say that, okay, this is an anti-colonial struggle on a more democratic level and from a bottom-up perspective. I have to say, okay, overthrowing a government is not maybe the best way, and then one can criticize he's a military guy. So yeah, I'm not sure if this parallel holds, and yeah. But on a rhetorical level, on a symbolic level, it is anti-colonial. Now we have to differentiate, what is the outcome and how democratic these movements, this revolution, if we want to call them revolutions. I mean, sorry that I but I always try to draw parallels also to the actual situation. And
yes, no, I do too, but I don't think I wouldn't make that. I think you're right to say that those are not corresponding situations. I mean, I think what I find interesting in Cabral's demand for revolutionary democracy is, well, there are two things. One is the what they meant by popular power. Popular power was one of the terms that was circulated among the different Portuguese colonies at the time, still controlled by Portugal. Mozambique and Guinea. What they meant by popular power was the construction of commissions or committees at the village level that would have democratic decision making. And so it's not only this notion of a commission or a committee, assembly would be another way of thinking of the same thing that they're doing. But also Cabral says that this is a kind of school for education, so that democratic decision-making is not a given for the population as it is, but it has to be a process that is also learned in the institutions of democratic decision-making. I think that's something that has a great deal of relevance for the different parallel structures that have been in the last 10 years tried to be developed, from Occupy Wall Street onwards, that thinking that we need to construct lasting institutions of democratic decision-making, and that these institutions have to also be educational structures of democratic performance. So I guess I would, if one wanted a more proximate thing, I would relate the Guinea-Bissau example from late 60s and 70s to Tahrir Square and the assembly that was formed there. I mean, as really a more, this is now just historical anecdote part, but intriguing one, which is because the anti-colonial struggles in the Portuguese colonies were a crucial factor in the Portuguese Revolution in 1974. sorry, the anti-colonial struggles forced the revolution in Portugal by mid-level military officers who overthrew the fascist regime, colonels essentially, and then part of the revolutionary process in Portugal was about the construction of popular power, was the construction of these same kinds of committees or commissions of workers in factories relating democratically that way, neighborhood commissions, similarly talked about housing, etc., rural ones, so that the revolutionary process was one of these democratic structures. The intriguing part is the perhaps apocryphal story that the military officers who were fighting against these anti-colonial struggles learned political practices from them and brought them back to Portugal. And so that in a sort of lovely south is north way, the democratic structures of the Portuguese Revolution had their seeds in the anti-Portuguese struggle. You know, that the ones who were sent to be soldiers actually learned from the ones they were supposed to be killing. But I think maybe that's just a general way about that kind of about the spread of these democratic institutions. That's what I would, and that perhaps the current coup d'état, current various coup d'état in the Sahel and in the sub-Saharan Africa, that might be a way of judging, you know, or the ways in which they do or don't correspond to the anti-colonial struggles, you know, or the liberation struggles previously. The extent to which they institute such democratic institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hope that they are not, you know, we can hope that it will not end with nationalizing oil, gold mines, and uranium companies, but that they will democratize and yeah. We can only hope and see what will bring us the future. So I can only recommend the book. It will come out, I believe I did research, the Oxford University Press will release it tomorrow. I'm not sure if, So it is a wonderful book, and it displayed, Mozambique, the revolutionary movements in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, gay liberation movements in France, United Kingdom. Also, it combines also this perspective of okay, here we have gay struggles, here we have other forms, for example, liberation theology, which at the first glance, what does theology has to do with a social struggle? But then if you read the chapter, it makes sense. So yeah, it's a wonderful book, and I enjoyed it, and I can only recommend it. And dear Michael, I thank you very much for your time. I appreciate talking to you. It was a great honor, and I had a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Hope to stay in contact.
Yes.